Cool. Yeah. So welcome, friends. I guess we have reached the final session, the final chapter in our relationship C. And the thought was to cap it off with love. And I think it's very thematically appropriate. We will kind of read over and over again that love endures. Love is there at the end, past the end. And so, yeah. So to dive into our intro question, very simple. How would you define love? How would you define love? So good thoughts from a lot of us. There was the consideration of how do we as humans really know it? How do we know whether we're mixing this or mistaking love for lust? So that's something to watch out for. And then there was a really accessible and I say, yeah, true definition of just the bond and trust between people. I think that's real. So I'll pause on my own definition because I had a hard time as well with this question and just want to revisit and rethink with all of us after exploring the passage. So we are in 1 Corinthians 13. I'll be reading from the ESV. This is basically the whole chapter. This is Paul's letter to the Corinthians, to the church. And he says this: if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in parts, and we prophesy in parts, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now, we see in the mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in parts, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. All right, very powerful passage, poetic in many ways. Just trying to find place. So we'll go into some of the background on this passage. So this is 1 Corinthians 13. And just the previous chapter, Paul was talking about different spiritual gifts. He was addressing the Corinthians for basically what I saw was that they were comparing each other's spiritual gifts. So he names, right, all these gifts in the beginning, speaking in tongues. So in languages that the speaker doesn't know naturally. And then prophetic powers. So speaking the truth, we often think of prophecy as speaking about the future. It does include that, but just speaking God's truth. And then understanding mysteries, knowledge. So all of these are gifts. And what Paul wanted to do in the previous chapter was remind them it's not about comparing each other. He made the analogy of body parts where it almost seems like certain body parts are jealous of others, like the ear jealous of the eye. The foot is jealous of the hand. I don't know if that was exactly it, but kind of along those lines. Right? Because one might seem more primary, but Paul is saying that's not what it's about. And then he's going deeper in talking about something, all of these, love. So it goes beyond these spiritual gifts, tongues, prophecies, knowledge, faith. And then what I find really amazing is in verse 3, if I give away all I have, I deliver up my body to be burned, but I have not love, I gain nothing. And so it's even beyond these grand actions of generosity, self-sacrifice in and of themselves, right? I think many times, and I think in general, especially for those who are spiritual and believers and the altruistic, I think they do have a lot of love in generosity, giving away everything. Delivering up your own body to be burned. I think that is powerful. But it's a reminder that maybe there are other motivations out there for doing these things. A very specific example in terms of self-immolation or delivering your body to be burned. That's a political statement for some Buddhists, like as an example. They set themselves on fire, commit suicide as a form of protest. So that's another example we can think of. So it's beyond even these actions. So we are considering beyond emotion and even action. And the thought and consideration is that love has a spiritual substance and purpose. So oftentimes we hear different thoughts on what does love include, or what is love really. Maybe the world often thinks of it as emotion, right? Just that feeling of romance between people. And so I think there is a lot of that, and that's an aspect of love we can't just discount, even in the church, even among believers. And then oftentimes, to elevate and to see something see something more, we say love is an action, and I think that's also true. That there is some outward reality of just what you feel internally, what you think internally. And sacrifice is a large part of that. That there's real weight in the action. And then now in this passage, as I was reading, there's something more than just love and action. So we see these examples of something more than emotion and action, and we see, all these examples, or maybe even beyond knowledge, as he says in verse 2. So what exactly is there? So this is maybe the part where it's harder to define, and I would just say that love has a spiritual substance and purpose. So we know the reason why we're giving away everything we have, if it comes to that. We know the reason why we do self-sacrifice, and we know the reason why we do these spiritual gifts, if we have them. And in the end, it's really for someone else, right? In these verses, when Paul says he gains nothing, it's really that sense of Jesus' own words is more blessed to give than to receive. Where is the other person in these verses? I think that's one thing Paul is pointing to. who are you loving? Are you thinking about your neighbor? Are you thinking about God? And those are the that's the reminder of our purpose in love. So this last point, including it in brackets, just because it's more of a longer story. So when I talk about love as a spiritual substance, I think there definitely is the thought and including just benefiting others. And I am just brought back to a conversation I had in college, just with someone, a classmate, someone in my year, and I guess he wasn't religious, and maybe I think asked me initially if I was, and then just trying to explain kind of some of the background on what faith looks like. And I think for those who have a hard time with the religion, it can be hard to point to something beyond, just what we know in the natural world. I know this is getting pretty philosophical, just even in terms of, what love is. Is it right? So how can you, from someone who's not religious, their perspective, their thought might be, what is there beyond emotion? What is there beyond action? And so I brought up this thought experiment in philosophy that talks about something called a philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie. Have you guys ever heard of this thought experiment? So it is just a hypothetical where you have someone who outwardly acts and does everything that a normal person does, but inside there is no consciousness. It's just like, just outwardly like a, I don't know. You can compare it to androids, but it's not specifically about technology or anything like that. Just a thought experiment. And
somebody, just lives a normal life.
Zoom. So to pick it up and some good discussion, it's basically, can think of it like as an android, but kind of as also discussed, could be technology agnostic, or we can think of in the future just simulating something, even like emotions. Is it all just neurotransmitters and chemicals? So what is basically like, how can we point to something like the spirit? And I think, again, this really is where faith comes in. And if we could pin down and point to something just physical or in this world, then the discussion begins again. Then we could just simulate it again, and then we're back to where we started, if that makes sense. So I think maybe this gets into, maybe I'm reading too deeply into what Paul is saying, but there is just a reality, and it's hard to define, but a spiritual substance and purpose that is very necessary when we talk about love. And outwardly, like, we often think of altruism, just helping others without any regard to ourselves when it even doesn't benefit ourselves. I think that's one of the highest things we can point to. But I think for some people, that's still not enough. They can think of, I don't know, other reasons. So I think it's tough, but this is kind of, I think, the evidence that we can point to and see, right? But in the end, no amount of apologetics or just our own arguments can really bring someone to the faith, right? It's God himself who can really help someone make that connection. So definitely lots of good discussion. So keep going to the next section, and here, just kind of reading the text in and of itself, Paul gives these characteristics for love. Okay, from verse 4 to 5, I basically summarize it as being humble. I think a lot of these characteristics are definitely associated in my mind with humility. And then at the same time, love can be meek, humble, but still firm in truth, not subservient, as we see in verse 6, does not rejoice at wrongdoing, rejoices with the truth. I see love standing for truth. And then verse 7, interesting translations. When it says bears all things here, there is that sense in the word of guarding and protecting, and that's how it's translated, I think, in NIV. And then, so there's definitely belief, faith, hope, and then endurance. Kind of to give a picture of, I think, why the translation is like this. In terms of protecting, it's like, it means you're basically covering something to protect it from the water, let's say, or the rain. It's just kind of a picture that the word in Greek gives. And then enduring is like carrying something, carrying like a load. So that's just kind of actions associated with love. And so I don't know. I know this is very simple reading, but at the same time, we can kind of think of love as a characteristic, and then Paul is describing this characteristic with more characteristics. And why does he do that? Like, he doesn't say that, someone who is loving will be patient and kind. And he doesn't immediately go to, oh, God is actually love. So, and God is patient and kind, and God models that. He starts with this ideal of love. And I think Paul, would agree with Apostle John that God is love. He's focusing on this ideal. And the way I see this and kind of interpret it is, when we apply these traits, when we apply patience, kindness, arrogance, not being arrogant, being humble, we don't point to ourselves. That's how I read it. Maybe that's what the world thinks. If we do these things, then, oh, it means that we are very patient but it's good to be an example, but we know that there's something more for us in the faith, that this isn't really coming from ourselves. We know that it's really God supplying all of these things, Jesus supplying himself to fuel all of this in the first place. And so that is how we demonstrate that God is love, in pointing to God when we apply these things. So This next part, personal example I've seen, well, you can think of it as examples. This gets into our ministry and our serving. And so many of you know that I've been in student ministries for a while, seen a lot of advisors come in and kind of cap off their term. And then, yeah, just their example of love is very humble in many ways. Spending so much time, right? Just hours a week in F&F, and then hours that we don't necessarily see. And then one thing I've noticed, at least for some of the advisors and helpers, is they often don't want an appreciation, or they don't want a large event that draws attention to themselves when they end their term. And I think there might be different motivations and just general thoughts on awkwardness, because some of them, still in the church, just not in student ministries. But I think the sense that I get is the reason why it's so awkward is a lot of these appreciations, maybe the perception is, oh, we're just praising them. We're putting them on a pedestal potentially. One of our previous advisors actually did kind of feel that, like he, in a certain experience, he was being appreciated in terms of, someone else, the pastor at the time was saying, oh, if you've been encouraged by this advisor, raise your hand. And then the advisor just said, oh, I had to close my eyes when that happened. It's like David's census, that it's just a number. And so that was kind of something that he shared with me. So I get that. And I still believe in appreciations. I still believe, we can appreciate each other, recognize grace in each other without putting each other on a pedestal and really praising God. So that's the tension. But I think that's just that humility and that motivation that I see in just our student ministries for our leaders is just, I know that comes from God. I know they're being motivated for God. They're not motivated to look good in front of others. And so that's kind of an example of love that I see. So is that okay? And then the final passage on love enduring past these spiritual gifts. So Paul's saying in verse 8 that eventually prophecies pass away, tongues will cease, knowledge will pass away. Wow. So he's saying that, how I read it is that these gifts will someday be unnecessary. Prophecy, speaking in tongues, present knowledge. In eternity, I guess we don't have to worry about the future. We'll already know God's truth. I basically think that knowing the full truth means that we don't have to seek the truth. It'll already be available to us. And so that's why these gifts, prophecy, speaking in tongues, present knowledge, will basically end. And he gives the analogy of growing up in terms of the knowledge that we had. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. So I think childhood is important, right? There's still real knowledge that's there. It's just the expansiveness, you could say. I don't know if that's the right word. the knowledge that you acquire when growing up in terms of what maturity looks like, it is very different. So I think the analogy that he gives, and then the analogy of seeing in mirrors versus face to face. So now we see in a mirror dimly, then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So I think this ties into our knowledge of Christ as well. Kind of, right? I've heard this said that knowledge and uncertainty coexist in our present life. We don't know all the reasons why God does what he does, but we trust that his reasons are just. And also that in eternity, he'll reveal just all that was going on. Yeah.
I always like, first of all,
Yeah.
because when the face to face, because I know
I think the mirror analogy is very interesting. I think there is really both knowing ourselves and knowing Christ and knowing him. There is a sense where we know who we're meant to be,
I feel
sanctified.
like we can't fully
Comes down to all of these spiritual gifts will become unnecessary. Love will always be necessary and is the greatest trait. As we see in the end, faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So eternity, I think, will be full and maybe even foundationally defined in a sense by love. So just to cap us off, maybe we can go quickly. No, we're a little over. Can you think of examples of people who are loving and don't draw attention to themselves? And how does this discourse on love affect your relationship with Christ and others? All right, lots of good discussion. We had the example of teachers, parents, grandparents, selfless in their own way, and then even famous personalities like Bob Ross, and then just in their painting and modeling of just being relaxed. And then I kind of get the sense in our discourse that we can't only be obsessed with giving and focusing on that, but knowing when to receive and loving people by letting them serve you when they want to, when they're called to. Okay, so very good discussion, guys. Let me close in prayer. God, I just thank you so much for this deep passage on love that you have put in the heart of Paul all those years ago by your Spirit, and now in us. And there's just so much to unpack. And I know just did a surface survey, but some good discussion as well, and just so many not only perspectives but real experiences. And we keep this in mind, keep these memories of love. Just whenever we go through a trial, whenever we struggle, help us to have this solid truth and reality that is present, spiritual. So yeah, I just pray for service today and the next series with all these things. Help us to know that you love us and to love you better. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.